Hi, this is Bobby Halton, and we are live at FDIC 2009, and I'm here with someone whose name is going to become very familiar to the entire fire service in short order, Dr. Jim Brown, who has just released a paper, a study which he did with several other docs and researchers involving the Indianapolis Fire Department. And what the study was about was the physiological effects of fighting fire, being a firefighter, on our respiratory stress and our cardiac stress. Am I saying that right, Doc?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
And I've read through it twice, so I feel like Sling Blade. I understood some of it. I didn't understand it all. But in a nutshell, I'm going to give a synopsis of what you did. You took the Indianapolis Fire Department. They have a great screening process. They got a good physical conditioning process. And you put life shirts on them.
Correct.
Now, the life shirt picks up what? Heart rate, things like that?
Yes, it records cardiovascular function by recording EKG, and then from that we can derive heart rates and look for arrhythmias and that kind of thing.
Okay.
It also has embedded into it some respiratory inductive plethysmography bands, which are simply...
Oh, sure, we know what that is. It's a flux capacitor.
They're simply bands that surround the chest and abdominal wall, and as you breathe, and they expand and contract, and we can track each breath that you take.
So what are you looking for? Was that to track changes or respiratory depth, or what?
Right,
we
see every breath, and then we can calibrate it with a fixed device, a fixed volume device, so we know how much chest and abdominal wall excursion equates to a volume of air. And so we see every breath and the volume of it, and then we see the number of breaths, and from that we can calculate what we call your minute ventilation, which is how much air you're moving over a course of a minute's period of time.
Now, so this life shirt is given, like the paramedics with the EKG, the heart rate and all that stuff is being telemetry, so it's being sent to a remote location, right?
No, it has that capability, and we didn't use that capability because we were just recording things and looking at it after the fact.
Okay.
From a research standpoint, we weren't necessarily interested in instantaneous data, look at it instantaneously. We needed to take that information back and put it into context according to what the individual was doing and what the circumstances they were in.
Okay, so in other words, it has a capture unit on it or something like that. So the men and women wore the life shirt. You caught respiratory, you caught cardiac. Now, what else did you catch? What else were you looking for?
Well, one of the interesting things about the study was that it became possible from through a relationship that we've developed with IFD over the years, where my staff and I went and stayed in the firehouse with the guys in the stations that we were involved with. We rode out with them, so we lived the life of a firefighter for about 6 months, a little over 6 months. Wow. We went on every run with them. What it enabled us to do was collect a lot of information about the characterization of the fire scene. Basically, a size-up information, what was burning, how big it was, how involved it was, that kind of thing. It also allowed us to keep a clock where we could look at what individual companies were doing at any given time on the fire scene. So we wanted to not look at just what's the heart rate of structural firefighting. We wanted to look at what is the cardiovascular response to fire attack, or to search operations, or to ventilation operations.
Or salvage and overhaul.
Exactly. So we looked at all of those different aspects, and by being there on the scene and having that access, it allowed us to do all that kind of stuff, which was really the unique part of the study.
And even just station life. I mean, you captured station EMS calls, you captured everything.
Right.
So now, you had like 50 subjects or 65 subjects?
Yeah, 56 guys.
56 guys, okay. So you have the 56 firefighters. Did you capture anything on duty, off duty, or was it all on duty?
This was all on duty. We didn't capture any off-duty data for this particular study. Those are things that we'll hope to do down the line. But we felt like we were asking a lot for the guys to wear that device every shift for their full 24-hour shift for 6 months, because they were new to it. Most of them had never seen the device, and there was a little bit of a learning curve. It takes a little bit of getting used to wear that device. So I have to commend all the men and women who participated in the study. They understood what we were trying to do. They bought into it. They supported us. They welcomed us into the station, and that was what made the whole process successful.
Well, I was a paramedic for a while, and as I read through it, I was incompetent at every phase of it, and trust me, my patients bore that out. But I understood some of this from when I was reading it. Some of my old paramedicine background came up. But the report's so well written, you really don't need to be a medic. And we've got it posted at fireengineering.com. Folks can come read it. It's an unbelievable report. The second time through, what struck me as I was reading it was what you found startled even you in terms of what kind of stress and what the heart's doing, in particular at fires where there's rescues involved and fires where the men are searching under extreme conditions. Tell us a little bit about what you found.
Well, it's difficult for us to discuss your typical fire. So what we talk about is a typical response to a fire. And if we look back in the data and we look at the average structure that we responded to, the average type of alarm, time of day, and all those kind of things, we can describe a typical response to that. And that was, we worked primarily on single-story wood frame structures less than 3,000 square feet. Not a real big structure.
No.
Not a difficult fire. I don't think most professional firefighters would think that's not a real difficult fire to tackle. It's not a high rise or anything like that. What we saw was that during the course of that fire, the average firefighter across all the different jobs was working somewhere around 75% of their cardiovascular capacity, which is a pretty substantial workload.
Okay, so let's put that into terms of firemen can understand. If my heart beats at, say, 80 beats a minute, my resting heart rate, so boom, 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 I'm not doing anything spectacular, hanging out in the firehouse, what would my heart rate go up to if it goes up by 75%?
Well, it really depends upon your age, and we base what we would expect your maximal...
I'm 26.
we would expect, well, the basic standard is that it's the maximum heart rate that you can achieve is somewhere around 220 minus your age.
Okay.
So if you're a 20-year-old firefighter, we would expect you to be able to get your heart rate up to 200 beats per minute. And so what we saw in the firefighters was that the average firefighter was working at 75% of that predicted level on just these kinds of single-story wood frame, no what we call extraneous stressors, no rescue, no substantial work.
So if the firefighter's 50 years old, or say 55 years old or whatever, you subtract that from 220, and so if it was a 30-year-old firefighter, his heart rate could go to 190 safely. That's 75%.
We would expect he'd be able to get his heart rate up to 190.
Holy mackerel! That's pumping.
Yeah, that would be a maximal effort. The other thing about that is we wouldn't expect the average person, or even a well-trained person, to be able to sustain that kind of heart rate for a very long period of time.
So say
minutes maybe.
But in a firefight, say we're going in and we're making, say, a third floor, and we're trying to make a grab down a hallway. So my heart rate could get up to well, for me, if it was 75%, it'd be up around 170, right in there. So if it's up to about 170, 165 actually. So if it gets up to around 165, that could be dangerous for a guy my age, right?
Not necessarily.
55-year-old guy?
If your heart is healthy, your cardiovascular system is healthy, it's probably not dangerous for you.
Okay, so when does it get dangerous, Doc?
It gets dangerous when you have firefighters in those kind of situations, or anybody in those kind of situations where they have some kind of underlying cardiovascular disease.
Okay.
And
some plaque buildup in my arteries, or arteriosclerotic disease.
Unfortunately, some of that is subclinical, where it's not previously known.
Sure, a guy could have a mild infarct, not really know it, but he's got tissue damage.
Exactly, and these are the kind of people that have been shown to be at risk on the fire ground. There was a study done a few years ago by a researcher at Harvard named Stefano Kales.
I remember reading it, Dr. Kales, right? Went
back and looked over the last 20 years or so at all the firefighter deaths and looked for underlying causes. And what he found out was more than 95% of the firefighter line-of-duty deaths due to heart attack were in individuals who had underlying cardiovascular disease.
And most of them were unaware of it, too, weren't they?
Most of them were unaware of it. So right there it tells you something about the firefighters that are dying. We can help them prevent some of those kind of deaths by increasing our monitoring methods
Okay.
by looking at preventative medicine, using those kinds of things to detect problems before they become a problem.
Now, there was another piece of the study, and besides just underlying arteriosclerotic disease contributing or pre-existing conditions, you talked about fitness levels in there, and on urban firefighters. And correct me if I go afield here, but as I understand it, your conclusion is that to be an urban firefighter who gets repeated firework, a New York City, a Detroit, Los Angeles, a Denver, one of these cities that really pumps out a lot of calls, the physical conditioning for that individual should be to the elite athlete status?
What we want to do is we want people to understand that the fitness level that you need to have to be a firefighter, to fight these kind of fires, in some ways is dependent upon how much fire you're going to fight. If you're a rural southern Indiana firefighter who might see a handful of structural fires in a year, and most of those you're going to fight in a defensive mode, if you're just a healthy person with a healthy heart and those kind of things, you're probably not going to have any problems. But in an urban environment where response times are very quick and departments typically undertake aggressive interior attacks, and they're doing these things 200, 300, 400 times a year, those two situations are vastly different. The repeated insult to the body has to cause some problems for those people. And so my feeling is that the fitness requirement for those people should be much higher.
Wow.
And they need to be trained as a firefighter athlete. I've heard that term used in the fire service before.
There was a man named Mack years ago wrote a book called his name was Gary Mack, I believe, but he wrote The Mental Aspects of Performance, MAP. And he said exactly that. It was another doc, same kind of thing. So it's great to hear someone else's. He passed away, unfortunately, and I think it kind of the torch, I guess, has been passed to you now to try to wake up the fire service again. That physical conditioning, especially for the urban guys, is key.
The analogy that I use, and I think I used this in the report, was that the difference between the performance level between that rural volunteer firefighter and that urban, busy firehouse guy who's going to fight so many fires, maybe 2, 3 a shift during certain periods of the year. Those firefighters, the difference between those two things would equate to being the difference between a high school athlete and maybe an NFL athlete on a football field.
Wow.
And so you train those people differently.
Wow.
And I think that we need to get into some discussions at some point about the different types of training that need to be done for these people. I feel like some of the standards that are out there right now are not high enough for some of the professional.
And you're the very first researcher ever to actually capture data, this kind of data, in real fire environments with real firefighters doing it. It's always been done in training prior to this, right? So
there were a couple of studies. There was a study in 1976 where they put a.
But they didn't have anything. They didn't have anything like the life shirt, though.
No. They just had ECG stuff, and they were really looking for cardiac anomalies, or arrhythmias and stuff.
Because the respiratory rate contributes to it. In other words, I'm under stress. I'm breathing faster, so my oxygen uptake is actually less. Because we're kind of panting it in and out, and then God knows. You got to read the report. I mean, if you. God forgive you if you're a fire chief and you don't read this report, because you raised several very interesting questions about going forward. What does positive pressure do in terms of lung capacity, in terms of exhalation capability, in terms of the physiology that you guys are looking at? Well, I never even thought about that, as a firefighter before. It was.
There's some of those kind of things that we can look at in our laboratory, in the traditional laboratory at the university, and some of my graduate students are actually beginning to look at those metabolic costs of breathing on an SCBA and how much energy expenditure is kind of robbed from the body to be able to do that. That's one aspect of it.
Now, are you going to be able to keep going forward, Doc? Are you going to get funded to keep looking at us?
Well, we hope so. We have we're always looking for different multiple avenues of funding, because you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket here. But so far, we've been very dependent upon the Fire Act grant stuff that comes out of FEMA.
Well, I think this is, if anything, this is very, very good use of tax dollars and Fire Act grant money.
We have an extended program that we kind of have planned out that we have developed based on the work that we've done, and then consulting with our partners in the fire service, Indianapolis Fire Department, some great people here who have really encouraged us, and some other people around the country that help us map the direction in terms of what needs to be done. We currently have an application in to FEMA for another study that will involve looking at the aspects of sleep. Kind of the big picture here is that once Dr. Kales in his paper identified who was dying on the fire ground, then the question, and they kind of raised the suggestion in their paper, was that you have a bunch of unhealthy people that are doing things that are extremely physical. But there was this question about how physical is that? And is it physical enough to cause this kind of, these kind of cardiac events? And I think that's the question that our study answered, because we were talking about relatively small, simple structures, but yet we saw incidences where physiology was driven to extremes.
Yeah, we weren't in shopping malls, we weren't in high-rises, we weren't doing some of the more esoteric stuff that we do from time to time.
So we know that firefighting now in itself can be a trigger for those kind of things. It can drive your cardiovascular stress high enough that it's going to induce those kind of events if you're a person at risk with these kind of underlying cardiovascular diseases.
Wow.
And now it becomes, the question that I have is, well, is there something about firefighting itself that may accelerate the process? Maybe there's something about firefighting that accelerates the development of cardiovascular disease. And that's where things like toxic gas exposures come into play, and some of the other things that we hope to look at down the line. And I know that there's some interest now in the fire service by looking at some of the research agendas that are out there. People are beginning to get interested in cyanide and carbon monoxide and some of the other toxic gases on the fire ground. Those things have been shown in other industries to cause exposure to things like cyanide at a low but chronic level, have been shown to cause cardiovascular problems and neurologic problems. Firefighters are not exposed to it every day, but they're exposed to it on a regular basis.
Sure,
so
small accumulation of it over time.
So what happens, over a 25-year career if you're exposed to those things on a regular basis? Does it accelerate that process? These are all questions that we have to start looking at now.
I'm glad we got guys like you on our side, Doc. I can't believe it. It's just amazing to have men like you helping us. Now, I want to talk to you about one other report that you just did, if you wouldn't mind sharing a few more minutes of your time with us. But recently, Doc, you looked at flashover simulators. What propelled you to do that, and what did you find?
Well, traditionally, we come to FDIC, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to come and to the hot evolutions that you guys have, because it allows me to come in with my graduate student team and do some real science, do some research. Sometimes we're just testing equipment. Sometimes I'm training my students, those kinds of things. Other times we're really setting up to do a full-blown study. This year we were here to test some new equipment and to train my students to use it, because we have some things planned over the summer with some live burns. But in the past, we have come out and monitored the thermal environment inside the flashover chamber, and then looked at the physiologic response of people in the chamber, primarily the instructors, because they get the most. They get the worst of that. And so if we want to know what their physiologic response is, then we need to know what the stressor is. So we monitor the temperature in the can, and we look at how it develops, and then we look at the corresponding physiology.
What did you find, Doc?
Well, we've seen in a couple of these studies. We published one a few years ago where we saw the instructors would go in and they would spend some time in there. They would come out, and even on days like Monday and Tuesday, when it was relatively cool, the guys would come out, they would shed their gear, they would sit down to rest, and their heart rate would start to climb, even though they were sitting down. And what was happening was they were accumulating heat. Their body was accumulating heat during that process, absorbing heat from the environment that they were exposed to. And when they came out and sat down, they lost their radiator effect, I call it, which is when they quit moving their arms and legs and quit moving blood into those extremities, they lessened their ability to shed heat. And it all pooled in the core and drove their core body temperature up. And so we documented that phenomenon.
That's just the opposite of what you would think.
Right. And it's kind of
You always tell people, sit down, take a blow, cool off.
And what we really want them to do is
take a 5-mile jog.
Well, we don't want them to get that carried away, but we want them to shed the equipment, and we want them to do what we call active recovery. We want them to be mobile and move around a little bit.
That's incredible.
That's the important thing for that, because it helps them shed the heat, and you don't see those kind of. We've seen some really seriously high heart rates in people just sitting under a tree in the shade after being in the can for 30 minutes as the instructor up there in front, where they've really gotten a lot of heat, and they'll come out. And it usually doesn't happen until, after they've been in the can 4 or 5 times during the course of a day.
Right.
For the student who goes in, rotates through, comes out, is in there 1 time a day, it's not a big deal.
Yeah, but these guys are in there.
They're in there several times a day, and they're up there at the front where they're really accumulating heat.
Right.
And so it is a danger for them, and it's something that we work with now with the guys at IFD, and we make sure that they understand that when they come out of that can and shed their gear, get out of their bunker gear, we don't want them just to sit down, and we encourage them to participate in the overhaul of that can just to keep them moving.
Wow.
And doing things. It doesn't take very long, just a few minutes of that kind of movement will help them shed that heat.
But just getting that one simple piece of information out there to the fire service can make a difference for some poor guy or gal who, trying to do the right thing and teach, and then sits down and heart rate jumps, and there but for the grace of God. So.
Well, it is, and it's all these kind of little things that we can contribute. We feel like is kind of our give and take with the fire department and the fire service in general. It gives us an opportunity to do the things that we like. This is all we do now. My lab is totally devoted to fire service work, and we've established a firefighter health and safety research program at Indiana University, where I'm on the faculty. And we have graduate students in that program now, and all we do is focus on the health and safety of firefighters.
Well, we're absolutely thrilled that you're here at FDIC, and that all the great stuff you're doing for us here and helping us, and really just being here and being on our side. It's nice to know that there's some really, really smart guys out there trying to help us do our jobs better.
Well, we appreciate the opportunity. My history was with athletes, and frankly, I've gotten a little burnt out on athletes. There's only so much self-satisfaction you can take out of helping somebody run faster or jump higher. But I have to say that we've been welcomed in the fire service, not only here in Indianapolis, but all over the country.
Now, the formal name of the report is the Physiological Effects of Structural Firefighting. Is that the get
Yeah,
right?
Physiologic response or physiologic stress observed, physiologic stress of structural firefighting observed in career professional firefighters.
Okay.
Big title.
We'll cut it down and put a link on the site there for you.
That'd be great.
Dr. Brown, I can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you for everything you're doing for us. Thank you for being here at FDIC. I'm Bobby Halton. We're live at FDIC 2009. I'm here with Dr. Jim Brown, and I'll speak with you again soon.